From what we've seen in trailers, Senua's Saga Hellblade 2 looks absolutely stunning. It's an incredible use of Unreal Engine 5. A lot of the big feature sets are there, again going off what we have in the trailers. However, we've also been noticing that this game is supposed to run at 30 frames per second on consoles. There will be no 60 frame per second mode, which means on PC, this game could be very demanding, and we finally have the official system requirements posted to Twitter, or X, or whatever the heck these days. Anyway, this is what we're looking at, and there's a few things I'm noticing here. The biggest thing that stands out is that while this does so much right, meaning it tells you your resolution you're targeting, as well as the graphics settings, and the hardware you need to get there, it's missing an incredibly important detail: the frame rate. Now, I'm pretty confident that means that these settings that they're giving here are not going to give you a locked 60 frames per second. I imagine that means they are between 30 and 60 frames per second, sort of like what the consoles would be able to deliver. The point is, there's a couple of clues for that. One of the clues is that down here it says higher frame rates or resolutions can be achieved with the use of DLSS 3, FSR 3, or XeSS 1.3, which at least indicates that these resolutions should be native resolutions. But since it's not telling us the frame rate targets, again, they're hinting that to get higher frame rates, okay, but what are these frame rates, right? Plus the fact that it's running at 30 FPS on consoles. All of those signs to me point to these are likely not 60 FPS settings for this hardware. Also, we can kind of get a rough idea of how strong are consoles, and if those are running at 30 frames per second at something below the maximum PC settings, which is usually the case, then where does that hardware fall, right? Now we can get a couple of super quick things out of the way. Again, it's saying Windows 10 or 11 64-bit to run the game. You want a 70 gigabyte SSD. Notice it does not say SSD recommended, it just says SSD. So they are not guaranteeing the game will run well if you don't have a solid state drive. System RAM seems to be fine at 16 gigabytes, but they are not saying anything below that, so you want 16 gigabytes if they're correct on that. And one thing I will give them some praise for is that they list VRAM as its own category, because in a lot of times they just say graphics cards, and you have to infer, okay, is it the strength of the graphics card why they're recommending it, or is it because of a certain VRAM amount being required? In other words, it's nice that they're splitting this out separately. Because, for example, they're saying you can play the game at 1440p high settings with 8 gigabytes of VRAM, even though they're recommending an RTX 3080, which indicates they're not saying it has to be a 3080 because a 3070 doesn't have enough VRAM. The 8 gigabytes of VRAM doesn't seem like that's the issue going by these system requirements. Again, independent testing will be needed. But according to the system requirements, it looks like, no, you need the power level of a 3080. But, 8 gigabytes of VRAM would have got the job done, but it looks like 8 gigabytes of VRAM will not get the job done for 4K high settings, where they are saying 12 gigabytes of VRAM for that. Now, whether it really needs to be 12, or maybe you'd get by with 10, who knows? But again, this is the system requirements list. So let's jump into the graphics cards, because I think that's the most interesting thing to talk about. And so one thing that stands out to me is the Intel GPUs are much weaker than the other ones in their categories. Also, they're giving the same Intel Arc A580 recommendation for both the minimum and the medium, so low 1080p and medium 1080p. And then moving up to 1440p high, they go up to an Arc A770, which is much weaker than a 6800 XT and a 3080. So the Intel GPUs here seem out of place. I don't know exactly what to make of that, other than I'm going to mention that their power levels seem out of place here. When we look at the NVIDIA and AMD specs, they're a little bit closer to what you would expect, although some things are still maybe a little bit odd. Let's go ahead and jump into the minimum specs, which they're saying is for low 1080p. Again, no frame rate number listed, but as I specified before, my guess would be not 60 FPS, which means you're probably, closer to that 30 FPS line. So let's hop over to a tool that I will link in my, I probably just blinded you because they like a white background over here at Tech PowerUp. But this is Tech PowerUp's GPU database. And I'm also getting a phone call. Can I, yeah, they're gonna have to wait. Sorry, Darren. Anyway, what was I saying? GPU database. So if I go to the 1070, I can now set, not only look up stats about this card, but they have a relative performance chart, because a lot of people look at a system requirements list and they're like, okay, I don't have one of these specific graphics cards, so how do I find out how mine stacks up? And while you could try to find like graphics card reviews and hope that your GPU pops up in the same one as one of these listed, it's a lot easier to pull up a list like this. Now, that doesn't mean that this is exactly going to be perfect for this game, but it does mean you can get a ballpark figure for how GPUs generally stack up. Now, again, individual games and engines sometimes vary, but this gives you a ballpark figure. So the 1070 and the 5700 non-X, generally about a 23% power level difference between the two, which, as system requirements go, is not crazy, because, like I said, they're not specifying a frame rate target. So maybe the 5700 is getting 23% more frame rate than the 1070, but maybe the 1070 is getting about 30 FPS. Well, 30 FPS increased by 23% still wouldn't be 60 FPS. You see what I mean? So some people get too hung up on these. They're not, usually in system requirements charts, they're not saying these are exact equivalent. They're just like, hey, you can probably play the game at around 30 FPS on low 1080p settings. We've tested out these GPUs, seem to get the job done. Like I said, the Intel Arc GPUs, as far as how those play into it, the Arc A580 isn't actually that far off at all from an RX 5700. So this is where it actually seems like it fits in reasonably okay. But if we go ahead and jump up to what they're saying you would want for medium settings at 1080p, then now they're keeping the Intel Arc A580, but now we're jumping up to a 5700 XT or an RTX 2070. So if we look at how that's scaling, sorry, I was on this one. If we look at how that's scaling, then if we're jumping up to a 5700 XT, that's a bit more powerful than the 5700 we saw before. And again, a bit more powerful than that 580. And notice that we're losing the 1070. They're now setting the, it was a 2070 as the baseline. So if we hop back into that and maybe set, so the 2070 is about 32% more powerful than that 1070, although in sometimes newer games that use more like DX12 features and things like that and all of that, sometimes the gap is wider. So I will just kind of point that out. So if we set the 2070 now as our baseline, we're now seeing, again, the 5700 XT is right around there in performance. The A580 is a bit lower, but it's not crazy out of place, right? So these seem somewhat reasonable. And we're now, like I said, at medium settings 1080p. So I have a feeling that this is fairly similar to what you're doing on consoles. Now, consoles will generally run with dynamic resolution. So at times, the resolution might be higher than 1080p on consoles or lower than 1080p on consoles, most likely to lock in that frame rate. Consoles usually vary the resolution and lock the frame rate. That's generally how that works. How does a console stack up against this? Well, a console like a PlayStation 5, which is similar in power to a Series X, although they're not identical, is somewhere in the ballpark of an RX 6700. So if we look at an RX 6700, that is a bit more powerful than the GPUs we're talking about right now. The 2070 and the 5700 XT are reaching about 86% of the performance of the RX 6700. So it's not wildly different. We're similar to where consoles are at. So if the consoles are running at maybe medium settings, PC equivalent, which could be the case, we don't know for sure, and they're delivering, about a 30 FPS experience on consoles, with this class of hardware, do you see why I'm not thinking that this is giving you 60 frames per second here, right? Now, it's possible that consoles run at a higher rendering resolution than what we're seeing here, so maybe it's the case. Again, we have to do a lot of speculation, unfortunately, due to the fact that they're not giving us a frame rate target here. But like I said, I think that we're seeing between 30 to 60 FPS rather than this being a guaranteed 60 FPS. Again, also, I think if you could lock 60 FPS here, they might just put it in the chart. If we jump up to high at 1440p, notice we're both increasing graphic settings as well as increasing the resolution. Both of those things take graphics power. And notice that, by the way, we're at 8 gigabytes of VRAM for the medium at 1080p. They're also saying you're good with 8 gigabytes of VRAM for high at 1440p. Which tells me that maybe you actually could have got by with a little less than 8 gigabytes of VRAM here, or maybe you'll actually need a little bit more than 8 here, because you're increasing graphic settings and resolution. That usually does take a bit more VRAM. But anyway, that's where we're at here. We're now looking at the 3080 and a 6800 XT, and the A770 feels out of place. Here's what I mean if we jump back to the chart. So if we keep this 2070 as the baseline, if we jump up to a, by the way, here's where you might spot your GPU in between. And again, I will link this in the video description if you want to take a closer look at this, right? So maybe you're spotting your GPU in here. Here's the A750. Here's a 1080 Ti, a 6600 XT. We're passing up cards like the 4060. We're passing up a lot of cards here. 6700 XT, 3060 Ti. We're passing up the 3070. We're jumping all the way up to a 6800 XT and a 3080, which are fairly close in non-ray traced performance. And notice that we are just about doubling the performance of the 2070 when we do this, right? Which means that, if we look back at the system requirements chart, if we're doubling the performance requirement when we go up here, but we're increasing the resolution significantly, 1080p to 1440p is a large increase in the number of pixels, and we're increasing the graphics settings, that makes sense, right? So if you were expecting this one to be 30 FPS, I doubt this one's 60 FPS, because just going from the same settings to jump from 30 to 60 would require doubling the GPU power, right? But here we're increasing the settings and the resolution, so I would be surprised if this one was going up to 60 FPS, unless this one was already close to 60 FPS. But I said, based on what the consoles are doing at 30 FPS, I'd be surprised, unless consoles are actually rendering at a much higher resolution than I'm anticipating. We'll have to see how that goes. Again, a lot of this is guesswork right now on my part, just going off of the little information that we do have at this point. But anyway, that's where these are at. Now, why am I saying the A770 feels totally out of place here? Well, if we look at when did we pass the A770? We passed the A770 way back here. That's only a little bit more powerful than a 2070. And now we're way past that when we're getting the 6800 XT and 3080 territory. So that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, unless they're just saying, okay, the A770 can do this, but maybe on the Intel GPU they're using XeSS and they're just not stating that clearly. Again, that's the one thing in this chart that feels completely out of place to me, is that ARC A770. Now, how about jumping up to 4K high settings? So 4K high settings, again, notice you're saying at the high settings. So that's the same as what we had at 1440p, but we're jumping from 1440p to 4K. Generally running the same settings at 1440p, but jumping up to 4K resolution in Unreal Engine, I've noticed you basically cut your performance in half, or in other words, the GPU demand kind of doubles. That's generally what I've seen happening when benchmarking. So that means that I also don't think that the 4080 and the 7900 XTX are giving you 60 FPS at a native 4K resolution. Because, again, if we jump back to our performance charts, if I lock in the 6800 XT or the 3080, I don't know, I'll go with the 3080. So if we lock that one in, and now we scroll up on our performance tiers here, when we get to the 4080 and the 7900 XTX, which are in the same class of non-ray traced performance, that's about a 50% performance boost, right? A 50% performance boost won't get you from 1440p to 4K with also increasing your frame rate, if that makes sense, right? You'll use that up just getting to the resolution increase. So unless I'm wrong about where consoles fall in with their 30 FPS line, I really don't think any of these are offering you 60 FPS at native resolution. I think that's why they're saying higher frame rates or resolutions can be achieved through the use of DLSS 3, FSR 3, or XeSS 1.3, meaning I think that this kind of hardware probably can achieve, especially if we're talking at this, 1440p and 4K line, but even maybe here at these medium cards at medium 1080p. I think if you're using resolution scaling, Unreal Engine 5 in my testing responds extremely well to upscaling from a performance standpoint. Or the other way of looking at it, it's extremely demanding on a per pixel basis. So by lowering the internal rendering resolution using upscaling, Unreal Engine 5 games generally increase performance massively, much more so than just the average game, especially on other engines and things like that. So with that in mind, I would say that I think if you're kicking on DLSS or FSR or XeSS like they're mentioning here, then it looks like we will, I think, hit those higher frame rates. That's how I'm reading into all of this. Maybe you guys disagree. Speaking of which, it's nice to see that it looks like they're supporting DLSS 3 and FSR 3 and XeSS 1.3. Notice they specify 1.3. That is the newest version of XeSS, which is really good to see. I'm glad they're doing that, especially in an Unreal Engine 5 game that is probably very reliant on upscaling. Also be interesting to try out XeSS 1.3 in this game because so far it has been very promising from an image quality perspective. Especially when compared to things like FSR. I'm also curious if they have Unreal Engine 5's TSR upscaling and whether it's the latest version of that, because that can often look a little bit better than FSR as well, if you don't have access to DLSS. So interesting stuff. We'll have to see how this all plays out. The last thing to talk about is the CPU requirements. So again, the thing about CPUs is that increasing the rendering resolution generally only has a small impact on the CPU demand. However, increasing some but not all graphic settings will increase the CPU demand, especially things like ray tracing does, but not. Again, different graphic settings can affect it differently. Generally, it's more things like crowd density, but what I've seen of this game so far doesn't seem like it has a lot going on. It seems to be more like a kind of a small scale game if it's anything like the first one. So I wouldn't expect the CPU demands to be too crazy. That being said, though, their medium requirements here, which again, if these aren't targeting 60 FPS, this is similar to what you see in consoles. A Ryzen 5 3600X is similar performance level to what you see in this generation of consoles, and the consoles aren't hitting 60 FPS. Now, does that mean they're CPU limited, though? I would say it's more likely that they're GPU limited, but sometimes Unreal Engine can perform kind of badly on the CPU. So we'll have to see how that goes. Now, if you want an idea of what these CPUs look like, the i5 8400 and Ryzen 5 2600, which they're listing as the minimum requirement, which again is not guaranteeing you 60 FPS the way I'm reading this. If we jump into these, the i5 8400 is 6-core, 6-thread CPU, but not super recent. This came out in 2017. We're in 2024, so we're talking about a 7-ish year old CPU, and it was mid-range back then, right? So kind of a lower mid-range CPU from 7 years ago, so not asking for that much, but it's also not the oldest, weakest CPUs we've ever seen. A Ryzen 5 2600 is a 6-core but 12-thread CPU from about 2018. So again, another mid-range chip from 6 to 7 years ago. So that's what we're looking at for the minimums. When we jump up to the kind of medium setting, again, we're matching more of console level performance. The i5 9600 is 6-core, 6-thread, so no hyper-threading on this one. And this is from 2018. And then the Ryzen 5 3600 is 6-core, 12-thread, and again, 1 generation newer. So we're basically just stepping up to 1 newer generation, kind of 1 year newer mid-range 6-core CPUs when we jump up to this setting. But again, no guarantee that's hitting 60 FPS, because the CPU does usually have to increase its workload as the frame rate increases if it hits, and then do you reach the CPU's limit? I don't know. They're certainly asking for a lot more on their high 1440p settings. I'm not sure if that means that going up to the high settings is more demanding on the CPU, or if they're just testing out systems that are a bit higher end when they're making their system requirements list. Because sometimes the system requirements lists are more based on what was in their testing systems rather than actually guaranteeing that you need this. So I'm just throwing that out there. We'll have to see what it goes with. But they're saying a 10700K and a Ryzen 5 5600X. So we're jumping up another CPU generation. But in the 10700K's case, we're getting more threads available. So we're jumping up to an 8-core 16-thread processor from 2020. So we're jumping up another generation newer, but now higher end to get more cores and threads. And if we look at the Ryzen 5 5600X, we're now still 6-core, 12-thread though. And we're jumping up again to 2020, generation of hardware. Again, 12 threads available here, whereas the lower end stuff they listed earlier from Intel was only going up to 6 threads. So kind of interesting on that perspective. And if we jump up to the highest end CPUs, this doesn't necessarily make sense to me, because we're jumping up from high settings and we're still at high settings, and we're increasing the rendering resolution, which can have minimal impact on CPU, but not generally requiring you to jump from a 10700K to a 12600K. Not that type of jump. We're also seeing the 5600X go up to 5700X, which is within the same generation and doesn't generally perform much differently in gaming unless it's one of the rare games that uses more than 6 cores. But that's actually kind of rare, and this type of game wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily expect it to be using more than 6 cores, just given what's going on in the game from what I can tell. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just what's in their test systems though. If we jump up to the 12600K, we're on a 10-core 16-thread processor, but some of those cores are efficiency cores. Rather than all being the performance cores. And we're up to 2021, kind of a newer generation here. The 5700X, like I said, is the same generation as the 5600X, but we're jumping up to 8-core 16-thread and a little bit higher clocks, and that's a 2022 chip. Anyway, so that's where we are at on this. So, again, the big question mark here is, what are the frame rate targets? I gave you my ideas on that. I think we'll have to wait until the game fully launches to have the actual definitive answer. If you guys are interested in me benchmarking this when it launches, let me know in the comment section. We'll see if we have time. As far as when does the game launch, I'm seeing May 1st, and it will be simultaneous launch on PC as well as consoles. So that's where we're at. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.